Hi, today we will explain the storyline of the movie titled To Catch a Killer, released in 2023. Okay, let's get right to the story. On New Year's Eve, a group of people were having a party from apartments to playgrounds. Suddenly, all the fun turns to horror when several shots are fired, killing the people who were enjoying themselves. Elsewhere, a police officer named Eleanor hears an emergency call from headquarters instructing all officers to gather at the Plaza Hopkins apartment. On the way, the radio reported that the number of victims had reached 25, with 17 of them dead. The radio continued to report on new developments regarding the victims. When she was in the elevator of the apartment building, a teenage boy named Jonah Miller had been killed in apartment 9B, and a police team was dispatched to clear the room immediately. Hearing this news, Eleanor became even more distraught. When she arrived at the scene, she found other guests in a state of hysteria. Eleanor immediately turned off the lights and approached Jonah's mother. Meanwhile, to avoid further casualties, the police radio instructed all residents to turn off their lights, stay away from windows, and remain indoors. Shortly thereafter, officers analyzed the trajectory of the shots. It was said that one bullet shot through the north-facing window, hitting the victim, then hitting the wall. Eleanor watched as officers analyzed the source of the shots with a laser machine from one building to another, namely the 17th floor of the apartment building across the street. At that very moment, the room in question exploded. Eleanor rushed to check on the situation. Meanwhile, fire trucks pulled up to the street to extinguish the fire in the room that had exploded. Not only that, but a SWAT team also accompanied them. Eleanor followed the officers up the emergency stairs. After breaking into the room, the officers declared that there were no victims in the room and the fire was easily extinguished. Shortly thereafter, FBI agent Lammark arrived at the scene. He immediately asked Mac about the occupant of the room. Mac explained that the owner of the apartment was a Norwegian man who worked as a financial advisor. Currently, the man was in Oslo and claimed that he had never lived in the condominium. He had acquired it from debt repayment and was trying to sell it. After the initial shock, Eleanor got up to return to duty. Outside, she heard that officers had already evacuated the other residents. The FBI would search the entire condominium with the residents' direct permission. If anyone became agitated, they would immediately detain that resident. Separately, Baltimore Police Commander Jackson announced that they would be working with regional FBI agent Lammark to investigate the shooting. Lammark then stepped forward to give instructions to the officers in the office. He said their desks would be filled with various pieces of evidence, some of which could be inaccurate or false. They would also hear many opinions, but he emphasized that opinions did not necessarily equate to facts, so they had to remain objective. After hearing Lammark's speech, Eleanor went to the kitchen and saw her colleagues watching the news on TV. They speculated about the perpetrator's motive, each with different opinions. At that moment, Lammark accidentally overheard their conversation. He asked the police to focus on arresting the perpetrator and leave the punishment to the judge. On the other hand, Lammark was interested in Eleanor's unique opinion. Eleanor said it was just her feeling. She suspected that the perpetrator would repeat his actions until he was satisfied. Lammark was impressed by Eleanor's thinking and asked her name before leaving. The day changed. Eleanor woke up to a call from Jackson in the early morning. He said Lammark wanted to meet immediately at a cafe. Shortly thereafter, she arrived at the cafe and saw Lammark in a heated discussion with a colleague named Jesse about plans to enforce a curfew. They did not reach an agreement until the discussion ended. Lammark then invited Eleanor to sit in front of him. Without further ado, Lammark stated that he believed Eleanor could be a detective because she was good at reading the patterns of perpetrators. Lammark also invited Mac to join their discussion. From now on, Eleanor would work as a liaison between Lammark and the police. So Eleanor's job was to manage the information Lammark needed. After that, they went to a meeting. Mac said that his colleague was sorting through all the events based on cell phone recordings and drone surveillance, which totaled 300 hours. Their next task was to clean up and cut the recordings in sequence. Meanwhile, the building broker was checking all the records for the past 6 months. He and his team were willing to be interrogated tomorrow morning. In addition, officers would interrogate the workers who painted the condominium. After that, Lammark asked his other subordinate, Marquand, Marquand said that the shockwave analysis team had found an M14 hand grenade. He then explained how the perpetrator had ignited the gas before activating the grenade and leaving the scene. The perpetrator is also suspected of having tried to break into the room with various keys he had. Now, the ballistics team has provided funds to examine data on sniper weapons used in the Vietnam War. The data was updated in 1975, but the weapon used by the perpetrator appears to be an authentic weapon that is more than 40 years old. If this is true, Marquand will have to manually match each piece of weapon evidence with military archives in all states. Lammark then asked what the Army did with weapons that were no longer in use. Mack replied that weapons that were still usable were handed over to local law enforcement, while the rest were dismantled and redistributed to Allied forces around the world. Eleanor, who had been silent until then, asked who dismantled the weapons. Mack explained that the armory guards were authorized to do so. However, he did not know who actually verified that the weapons had been destroyed. After the meeting, Eleanor and Mack followed Lammark to the morgue. The three of them fell silent as they looked at the rows of corpses that were missing several limbs. Eleanor and Mack agreed that the perpetrator must be a man. However, they disagreed on whether the shooting was premeditated. According to Eleanor, the perpetrator shot spontaneously. The victims also had no pattern, meaning they were chosen at random. Suddenly, a police officer entered and announced that the perpetrator had been caught. Lammark, Mack, and Eleanor rushed to the apartment building. They were immediately greeted by Frank Graber. Frank explained that the FBI was interrogating every resident when a boy set off the alarm. When they tried to ask him why, the boy locked himself in his apartment and threatened to kill everyone. Frank then added that the boy was bullied at school, had personality issues, and enjoyed violent shows. Not to mention, his uncle had taken him to a gun club. However, Eleanor was still unsure. Hearing this, Frank felt annoyed that unknown parties were interfering in his operation. He also told Lammark not to protest the steps he had taken. Meanwhile, Frank's men had broken into the young man's apartment. The man suddenly defended himself and tried to escape by breaking the apartment window. Seeing this from below, Eleanor shouted for the team to prepare a mattress for him to land on. However, it was too late, and the young man jumped and landed hard on the ground. Frank admitted that he couldn't find the weapon suspected of being used by the perpetrator. Lammark criticized this action, which was not based on concrete evidence. Back at the office, Mack managed to bring in 3 painters who were suspected of being the perpetrators, namely Rodney, Abraham, and Dimitri. Rodney was in the interrogation room with his baby. His alibi was very strong, and he had many selfies that proved that on that night, he was with his wife watching fireworks. Meanwhile, Abraham claimed he was at his in-laws' house, partying with his family, but didn't have any photos. Next, Dimitri claimed he was alone in his apartment and had called his father. During the interrogation, Eleanor stood in the corner observing the body language of each suspect. Eleanor found Rodney's body language and the accessories he wore suspicious. He seemed nervous and awkwardly carried his baby until it cried. The interrogation ended shortly thereafter. Eleanor returned to her desk to review the video footage of the incident. An officer then gave Eleanor the lab results, which she signed for. She wanted to give them to Lammark right away, but Lammark was busy on the phone. Eleanor read the report and gave her observations. This upset Lammark because Eleanor had read confidential documents without his permission. Eleanor simply apologized for her actions. Lammark felt bad for yelling at her. He then invited Eleanor to have dinner with him and his roommate, Gavin. After dinner, Lammark told Eleanor that he knew she had been rejected by the FBI because she failed the psychological test. It had been so long ago that Eleanor didn't think it was necessary to tell Lammark about it. Lammark was surprised that her psychological test results were so chaotic and contrary to her brilliant mind. Eleanor was forced to explain why she eventually joined the police force, namely because she didn't want to hurt herself again. She also couldn't get a decent job because she didn't go to college and was busy making a living. The next day, a suspicious man entered a mall. He stole clothes from a visitor in a clothing store, then cleaned himself up in the mall bathroom sink. Another visitor reported this to security, who then found him in the food court. After initially denying it, the man opened his bag and shot both security guards. Meanwhile, Eleanor was looking for information at an antique gun shop regarding the weapon allegedly used by the perpetrator. The shopkeeper said that such weapons were only available at the government's Department of Defense. However, he suddenly received a call regarding the shooting incident at the mall. He immediately headed to the mall's monitoring room, where Lammark and Mack had already arrived. After obtaining information about the perpetrator's characteristics, they watched the CCTV footage to see the suspect's movements. It was clear that the suspect was cold-blooded and shot indiscriminately with ease. The suspect also carried a number of hand grenades, which he threw when the police team raided the mall. Their mission now was to obtain the suspect's identity. Eleanor was optimistic that Lammark would be able to catch the suspect this time. She and Mack then went to the toilet waste disposal area to retrieve the green shirt the suspect had worn before changing into stolen clothes. They then searched through the piles of unseparated trash. Elsewhere, Lammark was being pressured by the FBI, Frank, and Nathan to take significant action for the residents, rather than just sheltering in place. However, Lammark insisted that such action was not yet necessary, considering that they had not yet identified the shooter. On the other hand, the local television station opened a telephone service for viewers who thought they recognized the man or believed they knew the suspect. Eleanor and her team also began checking the names of active and retired armory guards. While checking, Krupp received the results of an analysis of the shooter's footprints in the mall, which had paint on them. Eleanor became suspicious of Rodney again and checked his data file on the computer. Shortly thereafter, Mack read the results of the analysis of the green shirt from the trash can. He found hair and scalp particles, but no fingerprints. According to Mack, such symptoms are common in victims of severe head trauma. In the middle of the night, a man suspected of being the shooter called the television station. He claimed to be operating with a number of soldiers. While listening, Mack read the wiretapping team's report on the caller's location. After the call ended, they flew to the location of the call. Although the suspect's profile sounded convincing, Eleanor felt that this was not the person they were looking for. However, Lammark continued even though he agreed with Eleanor. They finally landed. Just then, 4 mechanics got out of the car to buy drinks at the convenience store. Several FBI agents, including Eleanor and Mack, were disguised as civilians. Eleanor also secretly told the civilian visitors to leave immediately via her cell phone. Unfortunately, when she asked an elderly man to read the text on her cell phone, he couldn't read or hear Eleanor clearly. As a result, the suspects they were targeting became suspicious. Marquand and Mack were forced to reveal their cover, leading to an inevitable shootout. 3 of the 4 accomplices were shot dead, while 1 was incapacitated with a stun gun. It turned out that the information they provided was just a joke from a Facebook post. As a result of the shootout, Lammark was interrogated by FBI officials the next day to account for his actions. Lammark admitted that opening the phone line on television was not his strategy. However, since he led the operation, he had to take full responsibility for everything that happened. He conceded and was prepared to be fired. Here, Eleanor felt guilty again, causing her mental state to become unstable. However, she refrained from hurting herself again. She felt calm again as she soaked in the water. Suddenly, she remembered Rodney. That night, she visited Rodney's residence to ask how Rodney could be in 2 places at once. That day, Rodney was supposed to paint the shooting location, but he gave it to someone else so he could work on another project. Finally, Rodney admitted that he had indeed abused the work system a little. He recruited ex-convicts to replace him unofficially. One day, Rodney met a mysterious man who resembled the perpetrator seen on the mall's CCTV camera. The man claimed to be named Dean, but Rodney did not know his background, only that Dean had once worked as a butcher. Next, a sketch artist came to Rodney's house to draw the perpetrator's face. Lammark and Eleanor went to a meat-cutting factory in their area to identify the perpetrator. A longtime employee named Ramona immediately recognized Dean Posse. Ramona then recounted that Dean was often criticized by his supervisor because of his strange head injury. One day in 1998, the supervisor was found dead in a gruesome manner. Lammark and Eleanor immediately took their leave after obtaining the data. On the way, Eleanor read out Dean's case history from 1999, but Dean was released on parole because his father was a former sergeant who trained the Rangers shooting team. Since retiring, Dean's father had worked as a weapons warehouse guard until his death in 2003. Young Dean's life had changed since then. Upon arriving at Dean's house, Dean's mother suddenly appeared. She admitted that she hadn't seen her son in a long time. Inside, Dean's mother explained that the gunshot wound to his head was the result of her and her husband's carelessness. When Dean was 6 years old, he wanted to help his father practice shooting. However, due to carelessness, Dean's father accidentally hit Dean in the head with 2 shots. As a result, Dean had to be treated for almost a year. While listening to Dean's mother's story, Eleanor noticed 2 cups of tea on the back porch and a man's shirt. Not far from there was a cabin. Eleanor was about to warn Lammark, but it was too late. A bullet struck Lammark. Dean's mother immediately stopped her from moving because Dean would shoot her too. Eleanor then asked Dean's mother to cooperate by taking the phone from her jacket pocket and Lammark's gun. Dean's mother then brought the 2 items outside and called Dean. From outside the cabin, Dean's mother said that he could go free because he had mental problems. Dean's mother believed Eleanor. Eleanor said that Dean could get treatment at a mental institution if he was willing to give himself up. When Dean didn't respond, Dean's mother finally shot herself. Sure enough, this provoked Dean to come out. Dean approached Eleanor and spoke. Dean admitted that he was fed up with the noise of the world and just wanted peace. He said there would be no more victims after this. He would do the same thing to her as he did to his mother. After that, he asked Eleanor to burn their bodies, then call his police colleagues so he could receive full credit. Suddenly, the sound of a police car approaching his residence was heard. Dean immediately hit Eleanor until she fell, then took her to the basement. Eleanor tried to negotiate and persuade Dean. However, Dean didn't care and prepared the bomb. Finally, Eleanor bit Dean's neck until the detonator button was activated. Dean fled into the forest through another door. Mac immediately arrived with a full police team to comb the forest area. Dean himself finally sat down weakly in front of a warehouse with his weapon. He was cold and had a wound on his neck. However, he managed to raise his weapon as a last resort. Suddenly, the police team that ambushed him shot Dean to death. The next day, Eleanor was offered a position as an intelligence analyst on the condition that she sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the original incident and acknowledge that the arrest was the work of the FBI and the police. Eleanor initially refused to sign. She asked them to award Lammark a posthumous Medal of Courage and transfer Lammark's pension to Gavin. Eleanor declined the analyst position, but the 2 FBI officials granted her request to become a special agent.